Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are taking a really fascinating psychological journey into the haunting of the mind. We're going to strip away all that dry academic fluff and look at how the very spaces we live in can become the exact things that haunt us. Let's dive right in.
So what if your favorite horror story was actually just a psychological diagnosis? Seriously, I want to challenge you right now to look past the ghosts and the ghouls for a second. Think about those classic thrillers you love. What if they aren't actually about the supernatural at all? What if instead these stories are basically architectural blueprints of the human mind? Because when we peel back the wallpaper of these haunted houses, we almost always find a very clinical, very real diagnosis of societal pressure, deep trauma, and complete psychological breakdown.
To lay our foundation here, we have to understand that the classic haunted house trope isn't just about cheap jump scares. It's actually deeply rooted in the Gothic tradition. And when we apply a feminist lens to those Gothic spaces, well, the domestic sphere completely transforms. It stops being this place of safety and comfort and literally becomes a claustrophobic monument to loss. The architecture itself actually starts to serve as a mirror for our own darkest, most deeply buried anxieties. To really unpack all of this, we're going to be looking at a brilliant feminist psychoanalytic study from the International Journal of English and Studies. It pits Shirley Jackson's absolutely foundational 1959 novel, The Haunting of Hill House, directly against Mike Flanagan's 2018 Netflix adaptation. And it turns out, these two texts are pretty much the ultimate case studies for understanding how domestic spaces externalize our fractured selves.
All right, to decode the 1959 novel and its main character, Eleanor Vance, we do need to bust through just a little bit of academic jargon. It starts with Sigmund Freud's concept of das Unheimlich, or, the uncanny. Now, in psychoanalysis, this doesn't just mean something is spooky. It literally means the familiar, specifically the home, has suddenly become terrifying. Leave it to Freud to ruin a perfectly good ghost story, right? But he argued that this represents the return of the repressed. It's the trauma, the guilt, the unspoken desires that absolutely refuse to stay buried, and they end up resurfacing in this distorted, terrifying form.
Let's apply this directly to Eleanor Vance in Jackson's novel. Shirley Jackson frames the horror here entirely as internalized female repression. Think about it. Eleanor is completely stifled by societal expectations, she has this deep familial guilt over her mother's death, and she's battling her own latent desires. So her haunting in Hill House isn't necessarily supernatural. Actually, scratch that. It's more like Hill House, with all its labyrinthine corridors, is a physical manifestation of her own fractured psyche collapsing under patriarchal pressure. The house is acting as a literal psychic prison that perfectly mirrors her internal disintegration. And honestly, this brings us to the tragic paradox of the entire novel. Right before her ultimate act of self-erasure, Eleanor just declares, "I am home." It is a profound, massive subversion of traditional domesticity. Hill House, this eerie, oppressive, haunted space, is literally the only environment that actually accepts a woman who dares to resist normal domestic roles. It's a really damning indictment of a society that pathologizes and confines women until the only place they truly belong is madness. But when we jump forward to the 2018 Flanagan adaptation, we see a massive shift in how this trauma is handled. Jackson relied heavily on subtle psychological ambiguity, like is the house haunted or is Eleanor just mentally ill? Flanagan completely replaces that ambiguity with a very explicit narrative of inherited familial trauma. The horror is no longer just individual psychosis, it becomes this collective generational curse carried by the entire Crane family, completely reframing the house as both a literal and a psychological prison of shared pain. In this modern version, the psychological anchor completely shifts away from Eleanor and over to the family's matriarch, Olivia Crane. To really unpack Olivia's descent, the academic text uses Julia Kristeva's theory of abjection. Now, abjection is the horrifying collapse of the symbolic order. It represents the breakdown of the maternal ideal, the physical decay of the body, and society's disgust toward it. So Olivia's absolutely terrifying visions of confetti and black mold spreading throughout the house literally symbolize this collapse of her own identity and her own mind. Now, what is really fascinating about this, and this is a huge takeaway, is how Olivia's character critiques what is known as the maternal sacrifice myth. In a lot of horror, and honestly just society at large, there is this heavy patriarchal expectation that a perfect mother must self-destruct to save her family. Olivia's transformation into a vengeful, active ghost complicates this whole idea. She tries to save her children by trapping them forever. It brilliantly illustrates how trauma disrupts the mother-child bond and shows the absolute inescapability of gendered maternal duty, even in death.
It is wild how the architecture itself becomes a villain in these stories. Every physical element of the house is operating as a gendered space designed for surveillance and confinement. Just think about the windows.
In the novel, they represent limited perception, but the series uses literal one-way mirrors to evoke the male gaze and constant surveillance. And the doors, they shift from mental thresholds of sanity to actual physical shifting barriers. Even the colors are completely coded, from the psychological green of decay and envy in the book to the visceral red of violence and the female body in the show.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that specific spaces in these stories, like the infamous Red Room in Hill House, operate on multiple levels at once. It perfectly merges feminist and psychoanalytic readings. The Red Room acts as this pathological holding environment. It pretends to be a sanctuary, a reading room, a treehouse, but it's actually like a giant stomach just digesting its occupants. It is the ultimate, inescapable metaphor for domestic entrapment, where the home itself literally consumes female identity.
And that brings us to a massive subversion in the horror genre. We all know the final girl trope, right? The lone woman who survives by adopting masculine traits and violently conquering the monster. Well, both versions of Hill House completely reject this. Eleanor and Olivia do not survive. And yet, the analysis argues this isn't because they're inherently weak. No, they succumb because the societal structures and patriarchal expectations around them offer absolutely zero escape. Their tragedy exposes the very systems that were basically designed to destroy them.
Which leaves us with this final, really profound question from the analysis. When we consume domestic horror, are we actually scared of phantoms hiding in the dark? Or are the ghosts we fear most really just the societal structures, the familial expectations, and the internal guilt that we feel we can never truly escape? I hope this explainer completely changes the way you look at your favorite thrillers, because honestly, the most terrifying haunted house you will ever step foot in might just be the architecture of your own mind. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.